moment. Okay, let me finish this. Okay.
Oi.
Deixa eu só ver se eu abri lá, Cláudio. Só um minuto. Posso começar, Cláudio?
Sim, já está fazendo o live stream.
Tá bom. Good evening. My name is Fabio, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Communication and Expression of the Federal University of Santa Catarina. It's a pleasure to introduce you, our speaker today, Dr. Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank is the author of many books, most of them bestsellers like What's the Matter with Kansas, Listen Liberal, and most recently, The People Know, the book about which he's going to talk tonight. Thomas Frank is also the Guardian columnist. He has dedicated most of his adult life to understand the unfolding of conservative movements in America and how the Democratic Party has sacrificed its traditional voters, I mean, the American working class, in order to happily embrace those who Dr. Frank calls the professionals. Dr. Frank has obtained his Ph.D. in history in the University of Chicago, which is well known for its economists who destroy countries.
Yeah, I know something about that, Fabio. We'll talk about that some other time.
Yeah, destroy countries like Brazil. Our Secretary of Treasury has obtained his PhD in the University of Chicago too. Well, Dr. Frank almost became himself a professional, but he saved himself and us from this fate. I think that the best compliment I can pay him is to use an expression the enemies of FDR used it against him. Dr. Frank, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is a traitor to his class. Okay. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Thomas Frank, the virtual floor is yours.
Fabio, thank you for that kind introduction. I did go to the University of Chicago, and just so you know, it's one of America's great universities, but just so you know, the whole university is not like the economics department. But you know, what can I say? I went there. It was a great place to study history, but that was a long time ago. And I'm trying to do other things these days. But you know, let's go back and take one last look at it. I went to the University of Chicago, and I'm going to refer to it in my talk very briefly, but I went there back in the 1980s, or I started there in the late 1980s. And I grew up, I didn't grow up in Chicago. I grew up in Kansas City, which is a city almost in the exact geographic center of the United States. And the subject that fascinated me when I was in those days, when I was at the University of Chicago, was a movement called populism. It was sort of the last great third party movement in American history. And I did a whole lot of research on it and even published an article on it. And then I lost interest in it and went on to do other things. But now in the year, what are we in? The year 2021, I discovered that that word populism is everywhere. It's, everywhere nowadays. It's the subject of every, foundation gathering and all of these sort of think tank sort of articles and all of this hand wringing and worrying. And I decided to brush off my old research and write about it one more time. So that's what the subject of my latest book, The People Know, that's what the subject is. It's about the American tradition of populism and how that word, populism, went from being a positive thing, a term that meant a reform movement, a really noble movement, an admirable movement, how it went from that to being this word that we use to describe people like Donald Trump. It's a fascinating story. And here's how I'm going to tell it to you, okay? Just a few short years ago, we Americans thought we knew what we were doing in the world. We were going to make this planet into one big likeness of ourselves. We, the Americans, had the experts. We knew how it was done. And our policy operatives would de-radicalize here. They would regime change there. Our economists would float billions to the good guys and they'd slap sanctions on the bad guys. And pretty soon the whole world was going to be stately and neat, safe for debt instruments and empowerment seminars, for hors d'oeuvres in the embassy garden and taxis that you hailed with a smartphone. Democracy, of thee we sang. But now we Americans stand chastened, humiliated, bewildered. Democracy. We tremble to think of what it might do next. So goes the wail of the American leadership class as they endure another year of panic over where our system is dragging them. The people, they say, are out of control. Populism is the word that comes to the lips of the respectable and the highly educated when they see the global system going haywire, as they have in the last 5 years. Populism, for them, is a one-word evocation of the logic of the mob. It is the people as a great rampaging beast. And what has happened over the last 5 years, the great thinkers of Beltway and C-suite tell us, is that the common folk have declared independence from experts and along the way from reality itself. And so they, the learned, have come together to rescue our civilization. Political scientists, journalists, policy advisors, technologists, enlightened CEOs, all of them joining as one to save our social order, to save it from populism. This imagined struggle that I'm describing, this struggle of expert against populist, has a kind of fundamental, almost biblical flavor to it. It is a battle of order against chaos, of education against ignorance, of mind against appetite, of enlightenment against bigotry, of culture against barbarism. And from TED Talk and red carpet, the call rings forth. Democracy must be controlled before it ruins our democratic way of life. Yes, everyone agrees. Ordinary people are upset. We all know that. But the ones whose well-being must concern us most are the elites whom the people threaten to topple. If the people have lost faith in the ones in charge, it can only be because something has gone wrong with the people themselves. As a writer for the prestigious journal The Atlantic put it in the summer of 2016, that awful summer This is what he wrote. Our most pressing political problem today is that the country abandoned the establishment, not the other way around. An article in the prestigious journal Foreign Policy, published in that same year, expressed it with a little more humor. It's time for the elites to rise up against the ignorant masses. What is populism, really? Well, once upon a time, populism was a label that people applied to themselves. It was not a made-up political science concept. The word was a proper noun. It was spelled with a capital P, and it was an American invention. In fact, the word was coined a short distance from where I grew up on a train traveling between Kansas City and Topeka, Kansas in the year 1891. The group that the word referred to, the Populist Party, was one of America's first great economic political uprisings. It was a gigantic mass movement in which millions of ordinary people learned to think of America's economic system as a thing that they might change by common effort. Populism's great innovation in its heyday back in the 1890s, populism's innovation was to make an appeal based on class solidarity. This was a new thing in American politics at the time. So the populists tried to bring together farmers in the West and the South with factory workers in the northern cities. This is what they said in their famous manifesto, which they published in the year 1892. The interests of rural and civic labor are the same. Their enemies are identical. What they meant by enemies were those who prospered while making nothing. Bankers, railroad barons, commodity traders, along with corrupt politicians who served wealth instead of the people. Hold on a second, everybody. I got to close the door here. I can hear people in the other room. So the Populist Party enjoyed great success at first, electing governors and senators and mayors all around America, but then it died out within a decade. It was our abortive attempt to start a labor party here in the United States, and it didn't work. But the philosophy that populism embodied didn't die. Most of the Populist Party's great ideas were eventually enacted into law. We got a farm program here in America. We got currency reform. They took America. We took America off the gold standard eventually. We got railroad regulation in America. Women got the right to vote in America, and the sort of great populist idea of ordinary people coming together against economic privilege. This idea lives on. You might say it constitutes one of the main streams of our democratic tradition here in the United States. And in my book, The People Know, I try to trace the development of this idea as it unfolded over the decades. See, Fabio, they know that I'm talking to you, and that's why they call me at this very moment. But they hung up. Anyhow, what I mean by this is that you can see a strong populist streak in the culture and politics of the 1930s, for example. And you can see it again in the civil rights era in the 1960s. These are both eras that have a very strong populist flavor to them in the American sense. Anyhow, that's the word's historic meaning. And when we use the word as a handy term for demagogues and would-be dictators, we are inverting that definition. Populism, in its original formula, was profoundly democratic. It was a movement that, by the standards of the 1890s, was anti-demagogue, a movement that was pro-enlightenment and pro-science and pro-equality. In its heyday of the 1890s, and alone among American political parties of the time, populism stood for human rights. Populism was the only party of its day that had prominent women leaders. In the South, populism defied the poisonous idea of white solidarity. Now, look, scholars and pundits and journalists have a right to ignore all of that and to divorce any word they choose from its original meaning. This is the nature of language. It changes all the time. I understand that. And it is perfectly acceptable to redefine populist however they please. But I want you to ask yourself, why would someone do that? Why would you use such a fine democratic word to mean racist, to mean dictator, to mean anti-intellectual? Why do that? The answer is that denunciations of populism, like the ones that we hear all the time nowadays here in America, are part of a long tradition of pessimism about popular sovereignty and democratic participation. Now, the name I give to that pessimistic tradition is anti-populism. And I have to say, I am absolutely fascinated by anti-populism. Tracing its history is probably what I spend most of my time on in this new book. And what you find when you start digging into the history of anti-populism is a habit of mind that comes up again and again and again in American history, always expressing itself in the same way, from the 1890s right down to the present day, right down to this morning's newspaper. So what is anti-populism? What do I mean by that? Well, this part of the story also begins in the 1890s. Okay, this is the Populist Party is on the rise. There is an enormous economic depression in America. There's discontent on every hand. There's huge strikes in America. The famous Pullman strike happened at this time, basically the closest that America has ever come to a general strike. There was a march of unemployed people on Washington, and all of these things are happening, and respectable Americans basically concluded that the class war was at hand. Okay, the class war is coming. It's just around the corner. Everybody can see it. And then in the summer of 1896, things come to a head. The Democratic Party, one of the two traditional parties in America, the Democratic Party meets for their convention. They turn against the sitting president, who happens to be a Democrat. They declare their opposition to the gold standard, which is what the US dollar was based on at the time. And they nominated for president a man named William Jennings Bryan, who is a 36-year-old congressman from Nebraska, who has a kind of amazing way with words. He has this astonishing oratorical ability. Now, Bryan was not a member of the Populist Party. He was a member of the Democratic Party, but he does talk like a populist. And he was with the populists on this one big issue of the gold standard. And a short while later, after the Democrats nominated this guy for president, a short while afterwards, the Populist Party, which is going strong in 1896, the Populist Party meets for their convention, and they nominate him as well. So this looks like, the class war is right around the corner. And these two events, the nomination of Bryan by first the Democrats and then the populists, this is the trigger for absolute hysteria among America's ruling class. To the country's establishment, there was no doubt about what these events signified. One of the nation's main political parties had been captured by a radical, and the shock was as great as like a stock market crash. Now, what I'm going to describe in the next couple of minutes is an insane overreaction. But whatever, that's how politics works sometimes, and that's how anti-populism in particular works. It's given to these periods of hysterical reaction, of these terrifying episodes of fear about popular democracy. Okay, and so here comes anti-populism in 1,000 expressions of highbrow contempt for ordinary Americans. Society's worst elements, they moaned, were supposedly lining up against its best. And the people who thought of themselves as the best came together to suppress the challenge. Journalists, scholars, university presidents, society preachers, millionaires, bankers, businessmen of every description. They all came together with the Republican Party to crush the threat posed by William Jennings Bryan. And the threat, and the word that they used to summarize this threat and their fear for what is happening in the world was the same word we use today: populism. Now, the Republicans proceeded to win that election, and they beat Bryan by using all of the classic methods of the 19th century. Including, overwhelming the Democratic campaign with money. They outspent him something like 20 or 30 to 1. They held these incredible parades, and then they did all the sort of corrupt things that people did in the 19th century. They hired an army of people to go out and, to cast many, many, many votes. They threatened workers that if Bryan was elected, factories were going to shut down. They did all of these things. But above all, the most important part of this campaign in 1896 was the way they built a stereotype of this nightmarish thing that they called populism. Okay, populism, the reactionaries of the 1890s said, and it's important to remember that the people who fought against populism in the 1890s were very far to the right, and by today's standards, of course. But what populism was, they said, was mob rule. Populism was anarchy. Populism was ignorance. Populism was a willful refusal to listen to experts. Populism was irrationality. Populism was the triumph of passion over reason. It was a form of mental illness. It was a kind of mass hypnosis. And since you're Brazilians, I think you'll know what I'm talking about if I refer to a book by, oh God, now I've forgotten his name. Gustave Le Bon. This was very influential. It was called The Crowd. This was a very influential book with anti-populists. They looked at William Jennings Bryan and they said, "This is what's going on with him. It is the people are in a state of mass hysteria." But above all, the way that they defined populism is as a form of insolence, an uprising by low-ranking people who have no business in government. Populism, the reactionaries of the 1890s said, this was the world turned upside down, with the intelligent and the capable cast down and the foolish and uneducated on top. Now, this had very little to do with what populism actually was. Okay, it was a stereotype. It came out of a climate of hysteria. It was a stereotype that was designed to be cruel and insulting, and at the same time to flatter the rich and the highborn, to give them, to persuade them to donate money to the Republican cause, to generate a kind of fear and hysteria, to scare them about the class war. But here's the funny thing. Even though the idea had nothing to do with what populism actually was, or very little to do, I should say, the idea lived on anyways. And it cropped up again and again and again over the decades. Indeed, every element of the stereotype that I just described to you should be familiar to you, because those are still the things that we say about populism today. So here's the mystery. How was that wrong idea transmitted down to us? How did an idea that originated on the far right in the 1890s become the common sense of the modern day liberal foundation world? How did that happen? So it is a fascinating story, and there's many twists and turns to it. But the part of it that I'm going to tell you about tonight that I think is most interesting happens in the 1950s, in the days of what was called in America, I don't know what it was called in Brazil, but in America in the 1950s, this was an era that we called the liberal consensus. These were years of incredible prosperity in the United States, and there was a new elite that was rising up in those days, a professional elite that derived its power from its educational credentials. And the great faith of this new elite was that mankind had arrived at what they used to call the end of ideology. Okay, this is a famous book from this period. And thanks to modern scholarship and modern managerial techniques, these thinkers said, the thinkers of the consensus said, all the great questions that faced humanity had been solved. We knew how to run an economy. We knew how to market a refrigerator. We knew how to contain communism. These are all the great ideas of the liberal consensus. But beneath the surface, the gentlemen of the consensus believed, there still lurked these very frightening forces, these mass movements of working class people that were given to irrational grievances and terrible passions. Now, it didn't matter to the consensus whether these movements were on the left or on the right. They were all essentially the same, and they were all extremely dangerous. So the proximate example that they would always point to was what's called Mccarthyism in America. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it was a kind of fanatical anti-communism that, the anti-communists who just went sort of crazy, looking for communists in every corner of American life and accusing people falsely and this kind of thing. But here's the funny twist. So these consensus thinkers in the 1950s were very frightened of McCarthyism, but the movement that they settled upon to explain McCarthyism and to construct their theory of the danger of mass working class movements was populism, this historical movement from the 1890s. And they looked back at this movement from the 1890s and they took its name and made it into a generic noun for the unreasoning folly of mass democracy. So they took this word populism and they made it their word for the opposite of themselves, okay? It was the ism that they used to describe demagoguery and intolerance and anti-intellectualism and the crazy passions of the mob. So the word populism once again became what it had been for the reactionaries of the 1890s. It's the exact same stereotype: anarchy, insolence, democracy gone haywire. Populism, they said in the consensus days in the 1950s, populism was egalitarianism taken to such an extreme that it rejected legitimate hierarchies. What is a legitimate hierarchy? Well, you know the answer to that, of course. It was the one that the intellectuals themselves had climbed, the hierarchy of scholarly achievement. So populism represented, for this group of intellectuals, populism represented the denial of their expertise. Why did this happen? Why did the gentlemen of the consensus use this word in this way? It happened because of a massively, it's a kind of a complicated story, but it's also a really interesting story because there was a massively influential work of history, a book of history published in 1955 by an author called Richard Hofstadter. He was probably the most famous American historian of that time. The book was called The Age of Reform. There's a sort of a favorite subject in American history. You know, American history is a dying discipline, but one of the things that they loved to do was tell and retell the story of reform. And before Hofstadter came along, the way you would tell this story, it would usually begin with populism. Populism was the first great working class reform movement in American life. Well, Hofstadter said, no, that's not what it was. Hofstadter was going to reevaluate the tradition of liberalism in America. And he said that the populist movement was not really part of that tradition, that populism had been an irrational movement. He said it had been anti-Semitic. He said populism had been backward looking. It had been xenophobic. It had been anti-intellectual. It had been conspiracy minded and all of these things. all because, well, Hofstadter didn't like farmers. He said farmers suffered from what he called status anxiety. So there was no way they could really be true progressives. Now, other leading scholars of the day immediately piled on in agreement with Hofstadter, using the word populism as a generic term for hatred of learning and sophistication and hatred of human refinement in general. It was basically the same old anti-populist stereotype from the 1890s, only jazzed up with a lot of modern psychological jargon. And so there's all these books appear in the 1950s denouncing populism from the left. These are liberal authors denouncing populism. They all agree on this. Mass movements of working class people are extremely dangerous. Okay, now then, this is the funniest twist of all. This crazy thing happens in the American history field. Now remember, this is Richard Hofstadter writes this book about the populists. He says that they're anti-Semites, they're backward-looking, they're xenophobic, and all this sort of, they're conspiracy-minded. There's all of these problems, these psychological problems with the populist movement. Okay, within a few years, Hofstadter's understanding of populism was crushingly refuted by other American historians. They proved that Hofstadter was wrong about populism, that the Populist Party and the populist movement in the 1890s actually was not any of those things that Hofstadter said it was. The Populist Party was not irrational. It was not anti-intellectual. It was not xenophobic. It was not particularly anti-Semitic by the standards of the time. For people who study American history, this is a famous episode, what happened to the Hofstadter thesis. It was refuted, and basically after about 10 years, nobody believed it anymore. But here's the crazy thing. That doesn't matter. None of that matters. Right-thinking people everywhere in South America, in Europe, everywhere, continue to use Hofstadter's wrong definition of populism as though that scholarly fracas never happened. In fact, today there is an entire pedagogy based on Hofstadter's wrong definition of the word populism, which is to say, based on a famous academic mistake from the 1950s. Why does this error persist? Why does this keep going and going and going? Ask yourself, well, the answer is obvious. Because his error is supremely flattering to elites. Whether our elite is one of inherited wealth, like it was in the 1890s, or industrial monopoly, like it was in the 1930s, or of academic achievement, like it is today, it is automatically drawn to anti-populism, to the belief that, this is a sociological definition that I like, if only responsible elites could be left alone, if only political issues could be kept from the people, the elites would make wise decisions. And so on we go, repeating the same eternal stereotype, the bigotry of ordinary people, the folly of mass working class movements, and the wisdom of elites. There's one last moment to consider, one last eruption that I want to talk about, and that's what's going on today. So, in the course of my lifetime, I was born in 1965, and since about 1980, inequality in America has grown worse and worse and worse, with the result that we have, in my lifetime, returned to a 19th century pattern of wealth distribution. We're basically right back where we were in 1896. And yet, by 2016, our left party in America had chosen to accept this. Our left party in America had become a great friend of the banks and of Silicon Valley. It supported harmful trade agreements. It regarded as its main constituency the nation's highly educated professional managerial class. Its leader in the year 2016, the highly accomplished professional Hillary Clinton, faced off against the bigoted blowhard Donald Trump, who made a great display of pretending to care about the problems of working class people. And to the great surprise of nearly everyone, this fool, Donald Trump, managed to prevail. The instant and automatic reaction among American liberals was not only to revile Donald Trump, but to denounce the ordinary Americans who had voted for him. Once again, just like in the 1890s, just like in the 1930s, once again, Upper America came together in airtight unanimity against the lower orders, the people they chose to call populists. And a new species of left practice was born. And I want to talk about that for just a second, and then we'll do questions, okay? So where older forms of left politics had always been optimistic about rank and file people, that's what democracy used to be about. This new variety of liberalism that I am describing regards ordinary people with suspicion and disgust. It dreams not of organizing humanity, but of policing it. It is a kind of geyser of moral rebuke erupting against teenagers who have committed some act of cultural appropriation, against a Hollywood actor cast in an inappropriate role, against a public speech by someone with unpopular views, against the wrongful dumping of household trash, against inappropriate tree pruning techniques spotted in a nearby suburb. So now they're calling me on the other line now. They know when I'm building up to this crescendo, right? And they have to do that. The characteristic goal of this kind of liberalism is not to get banks and monopolies under control, but to set up a nonprofit, attract funding from banks and monopolies, and then to scold the world for its political sins. We sort of upper class, professional elite, white collar Americans inhabit today a utopia of scolding in which the rich are not just wealthier than you, they are better than you. So here's my message. For a party of the left, this cannot be the way forward. To look out over a country in which the wealth of billionaires increased by $1 trillion during the course of the pandemic, in which monopolies have undreamed of power over speech, every kind of power, surveillance, in which medical bankruptcy is commonplace. It happens all the time in America today. The university that I attended in the 1980s and 90s, we talked about it a minute ago. That university today costs $80,000 a year to attend. To look out over all of this and to declare war on ordinary people because of their wicked and backward souls, folks, this is madness. I urge you, instead of denouncing the radical populist tradition, please consider what it actually means. Because in my view, it is the only chance we have of undoing my country's long right-wing turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas.
Fabio, that was fun. Now, do we have any questions? I don't seem to have the questions on my screen.
Claudia will read to you the questions people proposed in the chat.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for your lecture. That was amazing. There is a question from Eronides Moura, our colleague. He's faculty here. Bolsonaro is called a populist. Is there a right-wing populism?
So that's a really good question. And it's good that we started this off that way. In my view, no, there is not. But there is, so look, Ronald Reagan, Trump, of course, is called a populist. George W. Bush was called a populist. Ronald Reagan was called a populist. And I studied this right-wing movement in Kansas, 20 years ago. And these people deliberately echo populist language. They deliberately use populist language. However, as we all know, what they actually do is profoundly the opposite of populism. You take Ronald Reagan, for example. This is a guy that got huge tax cuts for the wealthy. He destroyed organized labor in America. He deregulated businesses, deregulated Wall Street, set the stage for the sort of takeover of America by the financial community. So what he actually achieved was exactly the opposite of populism. But he had this way of talking where he would deliberately echo Franklin Roosevelt. He would deliberately echo the Capra movies of the 1930s, his populist style culture of the 1930s. He was very conscious about this. Another great example was what's called the Tea Party movement in America, which again deliberately echoed populist language from the 1930s and cast itself as a protest movement for hard times. And it was launched. This always cracks me up when I think about this. The actual populists of the 1890s, for them, the greatest villains in the world were the traders in the Chicago Board of Trade, the options traders, the commodities traders. The Tea Party movement was actually launched from the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade by the people who were populism's greatest enemies in the world. And yet that movement was often described as being a populist movement. So what you often find, right-wingers in America who are very, very good at mimicking the historical left, but then, of course, delivering exactly the opposite. And this happens so, and Trump, of course, is the ultimate example of this. Trump basically stole so many of his talking points from the labor movement, his stuff about trade and all this stuff about, the working class. He stole this from the labor movement, but then he turns around and delivers exactly the opposite, delivers more tax cuts, more deregulation, and everything gets so much worse. This has happened now so many times in American life that I finally concluded that what all of this is all part of a deeper problem. And the deeper problem is what happens when a party of the left in America, our Democratic Party, what happens when they give up on the workerist tradition? Well, there's all sorts of, they give up on, certain policies. They give up on worrying about, unions. They give up on regulating banks. They become friends with Silicon Valley, and they give up on this language. They give up on the language of the populist tradition, and that allows the right, you got to remember the right in America. Put Trump aside for a second. The people who direct the right wing in America are very clever political players. They're very, very intelligent. Not Donald Trump. Trump is a fool. But a lot of the people who run the American right are very smart people. And they saw the Democratic Party doing this in the 1970s and 1980s and said, they're giving up on their traditional constituents. They're giving up on the working class. We can steal those votes. I'm talking about Richard Nixon. I'm talking about who was Richard Nixon's advisor, Kevin Phillips, George Wallace. These are very smart people. And they saw this happening and they said, this is our chance to steal the base of the Democratic Party away from them. So I don't think that these people are true populists, but they do try to talk like populists. You take someone like Steve Bannon, by the way. I'm sorry, I talk too much. I go on and on and on. Steve Bannon is a very, very smart man. And he was orchestrating the Donald Trump campaign. And this is a guy that knows this history. He's read my books. We know he's read them because he talks about them. And he's doing what I just described. He says the Democratic Party has abandoned its traditional populist base. Let's go take it from them. This is our chance. And he succeeded. He got Donald Trump elected. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, we have two more questions. I'll read them out loud to you.
Okay.
From Rachel Sutton Spence. I am a neophyte here. How relevant is talk of left and right wing in relation to populism ideas? Are there other ways of thinking about this than traditional ideas of left and right?
Lots of people say that. The populists were a third party. They didn't use the terms in America. We didn't use the terms left and right in the 1890s, and they would certainly have said we are something new. This is a way of getting beyond the traditional politics of America, which at the time were regional. So the Republican Party was in the North, and the Democratic Party was in the South. And, and the populists said, we're something new. We're a party that is going to bring people together from all over America based on social class. And it's funny, that's still a very shocking idea in America, that a party would do that and would have as much success as it. But I have to say, I think of that as a traditional, I'm pretty old. I think of that as a traditional party of the left. It's like the Labour Party in England or the Labour Party in Australia. These were all parties, or the Social Democrats in Germany. These are parties all started at the same time, trying to do the same thing. And that's the sort of birth of the modern day left. So that's what I think populism basically is. But there is a philosophical side to it. And again, I apologize, I do talk too much. There's a philosophical side to it that we don't take seriously, which is valuing ordinary people and respecting solidarity and finding a value in solidarity, in social solidarity, that you do not see in parties of the left these days. That has the Democratic Party here in America, as I described, is no longer interested in that. They really have become a party of scolding and a party of sort of white collar elites. I mean, there are some exceptions here and there. I think Joe Biden is, not always that way, but but Barack Obama was certainly that kind of Democrat. Bill Clinton is certainly that kind of Democrat. So what we need to get beyond, in my view, is not left and right. What we need to get beyond is neoliberalism, which comes in two flavors, both of them revolting. The Democrats and the Republicans. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, that's my joke.
Oh, no, that's great. But we have another question by Shed. Jason Stanley stated in his book, How Fascism Works, that fascists usually call their opponents what they are, anti-democracy, as an example. Is anti-populism following the same path of calling opponents fascists?
Ooh, that's a little confusing. So I'm not sure about that. Let's go back to the 1950s when this stuff really gets going. Okay, this is when you start seeing this traditional contempt for working class people becomes adopted by liberals in America. And part of the reason they did that was because of the experience of World War II. Now, we never had fascism in America. There were efforts to build a fascist party in the U.S., but they never got very far. But these scholars in the 1950s, I was talking about Richard Hofstadter, Daniel Bell, Edward Shills, who else? Seymour Lipset. These are the consensus thinkers of the 1950s. They were very concerned about the experience of fascism, and they had all read a famous book by Theodor Adorno. I've got it around here somewhere, called The Authoritarian Personality. And they had all decided that fascism was a kind of psychological problem. Fascism was something that was revealed in your personality. And so you could tell if someone was a fascist by giving them a test, a psychological test, by having them look at Rorschach blots or something like that. And then you could tell if somebody had fascist tendencies. And so they basically used the word populism as a synonym for fascism. Now, this whole pedagogy turned out was wildly mistaken. That is not really, fascism isn't really a personality disorder. It's something much deeper. It has to do with the structure of society and economics and the structure of the elite and beliefs that the elite hold and this kind of thing. But this was a very interesting turn. Now, I would say that the original anti-populists, and I apologize for going on too long about this, but it is a fascinating question, okay? And I suggest that everybody read The People Know, because I do deal with this a lot. But the original anti-populists in the 1890s, like I said, were profoundly suspicious of democracy. They didn't like democracy. They didn't like the idea of everybody getting to vote. This was really disturbing to them. And there was, like I said, they were really into the ideas of a guy, Gustave Le Bon. He was a French psychological theorist who was very anti-democratic. And then in the 1930s, and I should say they took, in the South, anti-populists took the vote away from Black people in the South after they had killed off populism. They said, we're never going to let this happen again. And so they took the vote away from a huge part of the population. That really happened in America as a reaction to populism. And in the 1930s, there were a lot of people in the American ruling class who were, well, let's use the word, they were fascist. They thought that Hitler was onto something. This is in the 1930s. And they were very disturbed by Franklin Roosevelt. Who was the author in the 1930s? The Revolt of the Masses. They had all read this. And they said, look, what's happening with Roosevelt and the New Deal and the labor movement, this is very dangerous. And we have to stop this. We have to nip this in the bud. And they tried to put together a movement in America that was quasi-fascist in order to stop Franklin Roosevelt. They lost. They lost overwhelmingly. So it's a complicated little history. But I hope that answer was helpful to you. Again, I can only talk about the American example, but I hope it's useful.
Yeah, I think his question might mean that anti-populism is really populist, not that it is fascist. Or I think it's really difficult to understand, but
that's a little confusing.
Yeah. Well, let's.
So I try to, when I write a book, I'm allowed to use to make up my definitions and then stick with them. And so I'm going to sort of insist on my right to do that.
Yeah, if I may ask a question myself, I think that in your speech, sometimes it's true, even in your speech, and let's not only talk, you're saying that you like to define your terms, and I'm going to ask you about your definition of populism. It's true that in some contexts, populism for you is something closer to social justice and just inclusion and getting common people to be involved in economy and broadening their opportunities. But there is also a wider sense in which you speak about populism as technocracy and anti-expertise, and then the element of social justice is more muted. Maybe this swinging movement is what people are kind of fascinated by, because sometimes it seems that your beef, your point of contention is that populism is politics, is the vindication of politics against anti-political forces. And sometimes the aspect that you emphasize more is that this is social justice. It's impossible to do so without doing social justice to a certain degree. Then you have a broader notion of anti-populism and a more strict notion of anti-populism. If I don't know if you agree with that.
Yes, you are right. Now let me try to lay it out what I think populism is and why we need it. Populism, so my definition, using the example of the 1890s, the farmer movement in the 1890s, the labor movement in the 1930s, and the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So these are my three big examples of what populist movements look like. The civil rights movement in the 60s was becoming a populist movement. It wasn't there yet. Martin Luther King talked about populism a lot, and he actually used that word, and he wanted his movement to become an economic force. That's what he was trying to do when he was murdered. So these three examples, what do they how do you describe them? What do they have in common? All of them are mass movements of mass multiracial movements of working class people that are multiracial and that are focused on economic democracy, economic issues. That's what all of these have in common. And there are other elements like their suspicion of expertise, which is not so simple. So populism doesn't dislike expertise, it wants to democratize expertise. This is what you see again and again and again with these movements. It's not that they always have their own experts, but they're usually going up against the orthodoxy of the day. In the 1890s, for example, every economist in America, we started off talking about the Chicago boys. Here they come again. Every economist in America believed that there was one way to organize an economy, and that way was the gold standard, and everybody knew it. And the entire global economy was based on the gold standard. And every economist in America, probably every economist in the world, agreed with that. And the populists were against that. And they said, no, this is the gold standard is a terrible idea. And so they were ridiculed as being anti-intellectual and anti-expertise, but in fact, they had their own experts and their own way of looking at it. And what makes this fascinating is that the populists were actually right about that. The gold standard was a terrible system. We now know that for sure. The economics profession now agrees with the populists. That system was terrible. And the system that the populists proposed turned out to be the right one. But what happened was, so over the years, the American left moved away from this idea of being a mass movement, of having a mass movement of working class people for economic democracy. Beginning in the 1950s, they decided they weren't interested in that anymore. And what the left really was a movement of highly educated elites who would get into government. They'd all meet around a big table in Washington, and they would turn the knobs, and they would adjust the levers, and they would make everything work. And you did not need mass movements of working class people to get reform. You needed experts. And that is really where the Democratic Party is today. That's really and truly what they believe. Now, they want people to vote for them. They still want people, millions of people to show up at the polls, but they are not interested in building a mass movement of working people. Now, the problem is that as we learned from the formative experience of my lifetime, which was the global financial crisis and the bailouts of the banks here in America, what we learned is that a left party that is organized around this worship of expertise is fundamentally incapable of doing, of achieving economic democracy. They will never be able to do it because of the class solidarity among the elites. They act as a class. They always do. They always will. They forgive one another's mistakes. And they make mistakes all the time, but they don't have a mechanism for correcting those mistakes. The only way to achieve, social democracy is through a mass movement of working class people that is multiracial. That is obvious to me. And that's why I say that is our only chance. And it does mean conflict with expertise to some degree. It does mean that. That is built into but it doesn't mean, like deliberate ignorance. It doesn't mean, Trumpism. It doesn't mean we go out and elect fools. So I know I talk too much and I apologize for that, Claudia, but let me say one last thing. The original populists, who I regard very highly, were not highly educated people. This was a mass movement of farmers. Most of them had not gone to high school. Very few of them had gone to college, but they were not stupid people, and they didn't think that learning, they admired learning. They looked up to learning, and they wanted to be learned themselves. But their idea was to spread learning democratically. And so they would have these mass meetings. It's sort of this very touching part of populism. They would have these mass meetings out on the prairie in Kansas, where speakers would come from the big universities and whatever, and would lecture to the farmers and tell them about economic problems and tell them about how you solved political issues and that sort of thing, lecture them on history. And there's a tradition of this in America of democratic knowledge, the idea of spreading knowledge out to everyone. And the way the populists thought about this is they said, well, if we're going to be a democracy in America, which we are, if we're going to be a democracy, you have to spread the learning out. You have to, it has to be accessible to everyone. It can't be held by a handful of people who hide behind jargon and, the ivory walls of, whatever the term is, of Yale and Harvard and Chicago and that sort of thing. It has to be democratic. The knowledge has to be democratic. And this is both very old fashioned and also, it's very lovable. It's very American. It's very Jeffersonian. And as I get older, I'm more and more fond of that tradition. And I wish we could have it again, but it seems like we're moving away from it as fast as we can go.
There are at least 3 questions more. I don't know if we can.
Why not, right? Why not? I don't have anything else to do. It's COVID time.
Let me try to get back to YouTube here. Give it just a minute.
I will ask a question.
Fabio.
Okay. When we Brazilians look at America, we have the impression that something new and exciting is taking place in the political scene. I mean, Bernie Sanders' campaign and the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other congresswomen, women and congressmen, and some strikes here and there, union trades emerging or re-emerging, Black Lives Matter, but you don't sound optimistic. Why? So
look, everything that you just mentioned these are all things that make me happy. These are the good things, these are the positive developments in American life. I'm trying to, and look, if you asked me that at a different time, I could be very optimistic. I like AOC. I like Bernie Sanders. I voted for Bernie Sanders. I was very pro Black Lives Matter, and I want, the union movement. I want the labor movement to succeed. By the way, today is Labor Day here in America. It's the one day of the year when Americans still talk about organized labor, and which is very healthy, right? We should talk about it. But the way I see things, that faction of the Democratic Party is, the centrist faction of the Democratic Party, the Clinton faction, if you will, has all the power now, and is absolutely intolerant of the of the sort of the left faction in the Democratic Party. And I'm very depressed about, I'm very pessimistic about the future for the left in America. And I'm sorry to say that, but again, let me go back to this fundamental principle that I keep talking about. To get economic democracy, to get social democracy, you have to have a mass movement. It can't be via experts. It has to be via a mass movement. It's very hard to build a mass movement, as we know from our history. One of my favorite historians of the populist movement in the 1890s was a guy called Larry Goodwin. He died a few years ago, but he wrote a famous book in the 1970s about populism. And he regarded the populist movement as the high point of American democracy. This was the most democratic moment in American life when we had the populists on the scene. So he wrote that book. He was an activist with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And then later in life, he said, he took a step back, and he said, how do you build a movement like populism? How do you build a movement like the civil rights movement? How do you build a movement like the labor movement in the 1930s? And he wrote some articles about this, very, very interesting articles, not widely read, but I went and found them when I was doing my research. And he said, you have to practice what he made up this word for it, ideological patience. Because the people that you're going to work with, and again, these are the people you have to work with. There's no choice in this. This is the raw material of a social democratic movement is working class people. He said, you have to practice ideological patience because they're not going to come to you fully formed. They don't know the jargon. They didn't go to graduate school. They didn't go to college, most of them. A lot of them didn't go to high school. So their heart might be in the right place, but they're not going to know how to put things and how to understand things. And the idea of a mass movement is you educate them and you build them up. But our emphasis today, if you follow Democratic politicians on Twitter or Democratic pundits, if you read their magazine articles, the emphasis is entirely on doing the opposite. It's on kicking people out. It's on purging people. It's on judging people. You've heard the term cancel culture. It's a sort of a general term for this tendency. That's what being on the left in America is all about. It's about being smarter than everyone else, being more pure than everyone else, being a better person than everyone else, and knowing the jargon, which often means having gone to graduate school. And that's why I say being on the left in America today is about being a ruling elite that is supremely confident of its goodness, but is absolutely uninterested in building a mass movement. Anyhow, what they're doing, these things, cancel culture, et cetera, is the exact opposite of ideological patience. It's the exact opposite of solidarity. It's the opposite of building a mass movement. There's no patience. These people are utterly impatient, utterly intolerant. Sorry, Fabio.
Oh,
that's my answer. Sorry.
You're totally right.
You guys seem like nice people, and I'm sorry to be giving you such a downer.
Everything looks amazing from a Brazilian point of view for the moment. But you're totally right. You're totally right. In Brazil, I think that politics is about innocence, the preservation of your own innocence, than to look at the future and build a project. It's the same thing as
That's
in
very
America.
interesting. Yeah.
Okay, Claudia.
Yeah, we are definitely taking advantage of our guests dumping tons of questions on him, but we do have.
How about we do two? How about we do two more? Okay, Claudia.
Yeah. Let's be a little bit more synthetic then. I'll just summarize a long question by Thor Veras. He asks, what is the risk of populism that you claim? Let me start again. He's asking whether the risk that you describe is confined to American tradition, or if we can say something similar about Latin American populist waves. So he's asking about what's your take on Latin American, Latin American situation?
I can't answer that. I'm sorry. I'm just not. I'm not an expert on. Look, I could have some beers and come up with an answer, but that would not be right. When I'm talking to groups like this, I only talk about things that I know a lot about, and I know very little about Latin American politics. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, and the next is not as short as. Do you agree with Nancy Fraser's diagnosis of progressive neoliberalism and Thomas Piketty's idea of the Bremen left as an impediment, as an obstacle to the victory of Sanders, Corbyn, and Podemos?
Yes, I do. And I am pleased to announce that I wrote that before any of those, before Thomas Piketty did. My book on the subject came out. Sure. And I shouldn't blow my own horn like that. I should shut up.
Yeah,
I mean, come on, let's be a populist here. Show some humility, Frank. But my book on this came out in 2016. Here it is. Listen, liberal. But yes, this is the, so I've written now 2 books about the sort of transformation of the 2 parties in America. The Republican Party, which when I was young was always the party of the wealthy. You know, I grew up in a very Republican area. It was very, very wealthy people. Today, that area is Democratic. The working class areas were always, when I was a child, were always highly Democratic. Everyone knew this. This is like steel workers voted for Democrats. You know, it was obvious. Today, those people vote for Trump. There's been this enormous shift in American politics, and we can argue back and forth about who started it, where it began, but it began with the stuff I was talking about, like those thinkers in the 1950s who were liberals, who were on the left, who said, we don't want mass movements of working class people anymore. And that became sort of part of the culture in the 1960s. And the late 60s, the American left really turned against the white working class because they perceived them as being pro-Vietnam War. And when this happened, and there's a lot of examples of this, like, have you ever seen the movie Easy Rider? Do you know what I'm talking about? So that at the very end of it, there's these rednecks who shoot the heroes for no reason at all, right? This is just part of this general turn against the white working class in the late 1960s. And when this is happening, the Republicans, again, who are very smart, very good players of the game, said, oh my God, the Democrats are abandoning their base voters. They're abandoning the Roosevelt coalition. Let's go take those people away from them. And they did it deliberately. Richard Nixon, who was a very, very smart man, he did this deliberately. Ronald Reagan and his advisors, they did it deliberately. With Trump, it's not quite so deliberate, but it's happening. This really happened. Yes, it is happening. And at the same time, the Democrats today are overwhelmingly identified with wealthy industries. They outraised, beginning with Barack Obama, they outraised the Republican Party. That when I was a child, this never happened. The Republicans always had more money than the Democrats. Everyone knew this. The Republicans were the party of the rich. But beginning with Barack Obama, the Democrats outraised and outspent the Republicans. And in the last election, Joe Biden massively outraised Donald Trump. And you can also look at it geographically. So the area that I grew up in, Johnson County, Kansas. It's a suburb of Kansas City, very wealthy, very affluent, one of the richest places in America. When I was growing up, it was very Republican. All my neighbors were Republicans. They owned the state. Of course they were Republicans, you know. Biden just won it. The first Democrat to win that county since 1916, so over 100 years. And this is happening all over America. Now, there are still lots of Republican billionaires. What's his name? Charles Koch. You know, there's various Republican billionaires still, you know, here and there who fund the Republican Party. But yes, this shift is happening. And it should, everything that we think we understand about American politics is being called into question right now before our eyes. Yes, it is happening. Was that a good answer, Claudia?
Yeah, I agree completely. And thank you so much for a talk. And I told you before the live stream, I am a real big fan of your writing. I think it's an amazing job that you're doing, rewriting the story of populism. There is another history to the use of this word in Portuguese, but we don't have to get into this right now.
So someday we will talk about, I don't read Portuguese and I'm sorry, but my theory is that all of these uses of the word came from Hofstadter in the 1950s, because this is when international, what they call global populism studies, they had their first conference in 1967, and they only invited one American. And guess who it was? It was Hofstadter.
Hofstadter, yeah, certainly, yeah. Populism in Brazil was called labor and then other people start calling the labor movement populism, especially after the military dictatorship, to claim for a new left, a more progressive. Yeah, so there were still people in America, and I have to hang up after this. But when I moved to Washington in 2003, and at the time the two factions in the Democratic Party, it's the same factions as today. You know, the Sanders people and the Clinton people, and they were fighting with each other at the time. And the Clinton people had decided to call themselves progressives, and the left faction were calling themselves populists. And they would have this meeting every year where they would call it, you know, the new I forget what they called it, but the new populist whatever agenda or something like that. These were the good guys. And then Trump comes along, and now everybody is using this word the wrong way. Everybody is using it like this now. Anyhow, there we are. Yeah, thank you again. And we hope to hear from you sometime in the future. So you're very welcome to return to your university. Please do. And
someday we'll do this in person, and I'll come down there, and we'll have a good time, and we'll drink beer, and we'll drink wine, and all right. Someday when this is all over, okay.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Before we end the live,
yes.
I would like to say that Thomas Frank has given me an interview that is published in a magazine, a cultural magazine we maintain in the Center of Communication and Expression, Subtrópicos. You can read it there, okay? Thank you so much.
All right, this was great fun, guys. All right, bye-bye.
Our pleasure.